How's it going, everybody? It's the CDH Warrior and
his dad
with another episode of Monday's Monday.
Happy Memorial Day, everyone. We'll start with the basic disclaimer, and what we do is just explain that we do not have medical backgrounds. We are not medically trained. We are not psychologists. We're not sociologists. But what we do have is a lot of experience. Almost 3 decades involved with CDH and other childhood special needs issues. So what we're trying to do is develop this as a platform to be able to discuss some of those issues. And as I said, I think I mentioned it, but just to throw it in there, Happy Memorial Day to everyone, and especially to the veterans and those that gave their lives for this country and the ideals that we stand for. Thank you very much.
So with that, let's roll the title.
Welcome back, everyone. And the topic that we would like to kind of discuss today is, as we were discussing, is kind of going through the anatomical system and the gastrointestinal and that issues. And one of the things that we have seen a lot of questions on is feeding. How do you get your children to eat? How do you get them to thrive? How do you go through all those processes? And it is one of those milestones that is expected in childhood. But it's also one that, from our experience with time, even with a lot of complications, the system kind of takes care of itself.
Yeah.
Do you have something to say?
Well, I was going to comment about one of the issues that I see a lot of in CDH especially, but a lot of childhood birth defects is FTT, failure to thrive, which involves most of the time a lack of weight gain, even if a child is eating a lot, that they don't gain anything off of it because their body is literally using all those calories to repair itself.
It is, and it's also, as have discussed in some of the past instances, we had 2 special needs children, 2 totally different instances. First, my son was a CDH, congenital diaphragmatic hernia, but then my daughter, at the age of almost 2, developed aplastic anemia, had to go through a stem cell transplant and a lot of the complications there. And it's understandable with a CDH child that, if they don't get into that suck, swallow, and eating mechanism right at birth, it becomes difficult. And occupational therapists have worked on this, is trying to find better ways to entice and develop that mechanism. In our case, it didn't materialize, and I'll go into the details on that. But it's also one, since we dealt with a child who was almost 2 and had gone through the nursing and was eating regularly as a child. Once we went through the transplant process and the health issues there, and she was having to be nourished using hyperalimentation, which is basically a central line with feeding through the tube directly into the blood system. That mechanism and desire to eat became difficult. So it took quite some time, again, even with a child that was in that 2 to 3-year-old range, to get that eating instance in place. Go ahead.
I was going to jump into this because it's one I want to talk about this in a later episode to kind of expand upon it on our Thursday series. But one thing that people don't talk about is when you have health issues, most people, your progress is this way. It's pretty much straight and narrow. But when you have CDH, my sister having aplastic anemia, any kind of major health issue, your progress will do this, it'll plateau, and then it'll drop again, and then it'll plateau, and then it'll go back up, and then it'll plateau, and then it'll go up again. But
Right.
we don't talk about that fact.
No.
That you can have regression.
It is, but what you're really looking towards in the overall, and
Yeah.
part of this is just from my technical background in a lot of these things, is you're looking at the overall graph, the long-term progressive increase.
Yeah.
And we were discussing just earlier today about, the question was, did he have failure to thrive? No, not necessarily classified as failure to thrive. But when you looked at the growth weight charts, always in the bottom 5%. So just barely making the marks. But we looked at, was there some increase in the weight?
Yeah.
May not be on the expected chart, but was the trend going the right direction? And were we not overall having a regression?
Yeah.
So those were the type things that we were looking at. And this, again, is looking at the long term. So what I mentioned is I kind of wanted to go through some of the details because ours were unique in some ways.
Yeah.
My son was CDH, was treated in 3 different hospitals. The final one was a new program in CDH treatment and a new protocol, which is now becoming
It's
pretty
now
much
the standard.
pretty much the standard now. But in the mid 1990s, it was just in its infancy.
And I'll go ahead and explain. It's the Dr. K's protocol, if anyone is familiar with David K's.
Right. But it was one that, right just a few hours after childbirth, the diaphragm was repaired at a pediatric hospital surgery center. And then he was transferred to Shands for continuing treatment and monitoring because the prognosis was in that 30 to 50% survival rate possibility. The hospital at Shands at that time was developing the protocol. Dr. Case was there along with Dr. Langham and Dr. Ledbetter, and they were developing a very good new course of protocols. But this was an instance where he went there. We expected that it would just be, kind of following their later steps in their protocol, and we'll see how it would develop. Within a couple of days, he had to go on ECMO. And we don't know exactly why, but his SATs were dropping down below 80, was not able to keep up his oxygen saturations, respiratory issues. So went on ECMO for almost 2 weeks. Came off, and the doctors went in to do repair on, just looking at some other things that they suspected, and what they found was that he had reherniated. Basically, the repair was not effective, so they had to move the intestines and other organs from his chest once again and make that repair. And what was noticed a couple of weeks after that was that in the instance of that, there was damage to his intestines. So it was fortunate in the fact that he was not interested in taking food orally, because any of that would have contaminated his abdominal cavity, and then we would have had a much more complicated issue. So in our case, as they went through some of the treatments at Gainesville, what they ended up doing was he was on hyperalimentation to provide nutrition, and they basically took a part of his intestines, brought that out through an existing opening from the previous surgery because they did not close up those surgical incisions, because the abdominal cavity and the abdominal muscles were too tight, and it would have restricted the other organs. So they left basically open his abdomen. And what Dr. Case was able to do was take his intestines, bring that to the surface, and put in a colostomy bag. So when we brought him home from the hospital for about a month, which was really just kind of a feed and grow stage, but it was, we felt psychologically better for the family and for him to be able to go home and find out that, his entire world after being in utero was not going to be in a NICU unit. We transported him home. Now, understanding in that case, everything had been coordinated by the coordinators at the hospital, so that we had a home health care system in place. That means that we had supplies available, we had oxygen, we had hyperalimentation available, we had all of the necessary equipment that was necessary. We had monitors, oxygen. Basically, our dining room became its own medical supply room for a period of time. So that was not, I don't think, typical now at this point in time, but it was not that far out of line almost 30 years ago, because it was difficult to follow the treatment protocols as they do now. And in his case, we did not know about his CDH pre-birth. So it was a total surprise when he was born.
Now it's pretty common for people to find out beforehand and be able to make plans of what hospital are they going to go to, which surgical team do they need, all of the things are generally set up now before you get to the hospital. Back then, it was rare to even know that CDH even occurred before birth.
Right. And the advantage that we had was that the OBGYN that we utilized was fairly young and had done his residency at Shands Hospital and had gone through a period of time in the NICU under Dr. K. So he was familiar with the protocol that was being utilized there at that time. So, like I said, I just kind of wanted to go through the time frame of this. For the first few months, it was hyperalimentation and waste products taken out basically through a colostomy bag, managed that way. It's really more just bile and other bodily fluids that came out through that system. Now, as a parent, it's a whole different aspect in life, because, heck, we could plug our baby in, didn't have to worry about dirty diapers and cries in the middle of the night. We just take out the gauze out of the colostomy bag and clean everything up and unhook the central line connection, and everything went okay. But that was not typical. He didn't eat, he didn't suck swallow, he didn't take the oral feeds. So we did that for about a month at home, and then we went back to the hospital, in which case the doctor went back through, took about 7 to 8 hours of surgery to go back into the abdominal cavity and resection the intestines, because there had been a fair bit of extensive damage. And overall, the doctor had to remove about 1/3 of his intestines, because they had been damaged as a part of the treatment and the issues and the surgeries that were involved in that. We've been lucky over time because we don't detect any major issues. There are some gastric issues with the fundoplication, and those things is he couldn't do the belching contest with the other kids in elementary school. Uh, so there were some of those things that we had to deal with. But once we got home after that second surgery, he came home with a Mickey button, which is basically a child is coming in with what looks like the
inflation part of a beach ball.
right, the inflation tube for the beach ball that's got the little flap that closes off, and it's got a check valve on it. And again, it's kind of an interesting aspect because we could get the feeding formulas together, put all that in place, and then hook up with a kangaroo pump at night, do 8 to 10 hours, 12 hours, whatever was necessary to take care of the feeding requirements. Slept fairly well. At that point, everything was kind of resectioned back together. So then we did have to worry about changing diapers, which is the typical issue that children and parents have to go through. But it was also when we started a protocol trying to see if we could get him to take formula. And that was never successful. Part of this with the CDH child and trying to just think about the psychology of what goes on is you've got a child that has lived in utero, everything's fine, I don't have to breathe, I don't have to eat, everything's provided for me. First thing after birth is, okay, I can't get enough air, I can't breathe. So there's a survival instinct from that aspect. Then if you try and put into that having to deal with liquids in the mouth and being able to make that transition from breathing to swallowing and that end of things, it's difficult for a child to psychologically understand how to control those things.
Yeah.
So, if I've got to make the choice of whether I breathe or I suck this fluid down my throat and choke, I'm going to worry about breathing. I'm not going to worry about eating. So that's part of what goes on in here. And, we tried for quite some time to, on a regular basis to try and introduce formula and work on that suck swallow. Never successful in that. So just to kind of give you some ideas of, how this deals with over time is, he did get to a point where, at an age where his digestive system could handle solid food, but he would not take the food orally. So we developed our own formulation. We had a nurse who was very good at explaining to us that she had had children that were older that had to deal with feeding through a tube. And she explained, if you've got a kid that wants a peanut butter sandwich or a Burger King Whopper, said, you can grind it up and put it through a tube. So we basically worked on a plan of how to feed. And this was, we would get chicken, we would get pork, we would get beef, we would get vegetables. We would cook those things. We would then run those through a blender and get them into a size that they would go through the pump and the tubes. You go through probably a couple of good blenders over a period of time, and you get a little bit tired of running things through a strainer just to make sure that they're small enough to go through. But a lot of his blood tests came back extremely well because he was high iron, high meat, very good diet because he was not a picky eater. He ate whatever we put through the tube, which worked out well. But also during that time, we tried whenever we could to see if we could introduce food. And you introduce food when you're sitting at the table, you're sitting in the chair, see if you eat something. Very rarely was that successful. Sometimes would lick at some things just to taste and see what it tasted like. Going to some of the all-you-can-eat restaurants, and that was always fun to go to a place like that and just go through the line and pick a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of everything, and see, is there anything that would be of interest that he would like to eat? And he would try bits and pieces of those, and that it was actually kind of one of those of comical, but we were trying to see if we could get him to eat anything, and we had watched another family nearby with their child, and basically they had the bib on the child, ran the bib out onto the high chair tray, put the plate on that. The child would just kind of eat and mess through everything, and then they'd just take everything off the bib, put it back in the plate, put the plate back up, and let him keep going at it again and going through. But you try a lot of different things, but you learn not to get frustrated. As long as there's still nutrition going in and there is still weight gain going on, you're winning the process. You are making progress with that. So you be happy with that. In his instance, we just happened to be visiting family, my in-laws at the time, and my mother-in-law was trying to see if he'd be interested in French fries or something like that, and he grabbed a chicken nugget and fell in love with chicken nuggets and started eating chicken nuggets. So for quite a while, we went through a lot of chicken nuggets, but that was something we knew. And then the interest in eating developed, but that was at about 2 years old. So we had gone through this for quite some time. But it's one, he's not a picky eater, but we happen to live in Florida near the coast, so a lot of seafood. And we found out he was a great connoisseur of seafood. He loved scallops. He loved calamari. He loved shrimp.
And if you ever look back, I have a cooking channel. Most of what I cook is seafood and Japanese.
Yeah. So, and now it's one that eating is not necessarily a thing, but it's also one that when I was doing the 2 feedings, I was looking that we were feeding him 3,500, 4,000 calories a day, and just getting a slight weight gain. So it wasn't a matter of that he wasn't getting enough calories. CDH children tend to burn up a lot of calories. There's a high metabolism issue that's involved. So, you have to kind of take that into perspective. But it's also one, even at almost 28 years old, the metabolism is still at a high rate.
I was getting ready to jump in on that one. It's like, so when is my metabolism supposed to slow down? Because everyone keeps promising me, oh, enjoy your inability to gain weight while it lasts. It's going to slow down soon. It's like, I turned 28 in a week. Not even. It's the end of this week. And my metabolism still hasn't slowed down. I'm literally having to consume generally around 1,000 calories a meal just to maintain what I've got, which is sad and scary in a way.
It is, but some people would really appreciate that opportunity. But it's also one that we know that there are respiratory issues and other problems just because not full lung development. But I will go back. Earlier today, we took a hike. We took a trek and trail up 2,000 feet up a mountain nearby, since we're now in the East Tennessee mountains. He did have some difficulty breathing at points, but it's also one, I had difficulty breathing at points, and other people have difficulty breathing at points. So, there are some issues to deal with, but it's not insurmountable.
Yeah.
And it is things that we can learn to deal with and address. So that's part of the reason that we wanted to have this series and start into this, is just so we can have an open discussion about some of these things. We really appreciate your time. Hopefully you're having a great holiday weekend and getting prepared for a wonderful summer.
don't have anything else to add to this. So,
Okay.
for the CDH Warrior,
And his dad.
have a great day, and we'll see you next time.
Okay. Take care.